All right, everyone, I think we'll get started. Great, thank you all for coming to this session on can a conflict-sensitive extractive industry value chain help prevent conflicts in resource-rich countries? My name is Josh Fisher. I'm the director of the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity at Columbia University. We're a research center that's part of the Earth Institute, interested in the linkages between peace, conflict, and sustainable development. I was asked to moderate the panel today. Based on my background doing a PhD in conflict forecasting using environmental indicators and social indicators, and recently using empirical evidence to support policy development for conflict prevention and management in the extractive sector. The question we're here to discuss today is, can a conflict-sensitive extractive industry value chain help prevent conflict in resource-rich countries? At a time when commodity prices are low, when corporate social responsibility budgets have shrunk, when government revenues from FDI are being lost, it's critical that we find ways to prevent conflicts in the sector. Because, as we all know, the costs of conflict are too high to bear. But the paradox is that just at the time when we most need good CSR practices, when we need government capacity for things like environmental monitoring and sector development, our capacity to use those for conflict prevention is constrained by economic conditions. In my work at Columbia, I've seen this play out in multiple countries, in Papua New Guinea, in Peru, in Mozambique. And the question we're concerned with is, how do we realize the promise of the extractive sector while avoiding the costs that backsliding into conflict can bring? In all the work that we've done at Columbia in the sector, we've seen that it's better to prevent conflict than allow conflict to then respond to conflict. So the question that I'd like to pose today is, what are the tools and strategies that can help governments realize the potential of their resource base by understanding, identifying, and preventing the drivers of conflict in the sector? And to help answer that question, we have quite an impressive panel, each of whom bring expertise and experience on different aspects of the extractive sector. Our first panelist, Ms. Lauren Kelly, serves as acting coordinator for agriculture, rural development, and environment in the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. Recently, she led the global review of high-value natural resource management in fragile and conflict states. Our next panelist, Mauricio Rios, is a communication and conflict specialist at the bank. He was the task team lead for a working paper on preventing conflict in resource-rich countries, and he'll be discussing that today. Our third panelist, David Jensen, is head of the United Nations Environment Program's Environmental Cooperation and Peace Building Initiative. The focus of his work is to catalyze the UN system to help member states address conflict risks and peace-building opportunities from renewable and non-renewable natural resources. He's presently co-managing a joint partnership between UNEP and the World Bank on mapping and assessing the performance of extractive industries. We're also honored to have Christopher Sheldon, here, who's a practice manager with the Energy and Extractives Global Practice of the bank. He's responsible for the unit's operations in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. And his goal is to support countries to develop and manage responsible oil, gas, and mining industries that contribute to inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction. Finally, we're really honored to have Danny Kaufman here. Dr. Kaufman's the president of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a policy institute and nonprofit organization operating in more than a dozen countries. Dr. Kaufman's a pioneer in the field of governance and anti-corruption worldwide. And he has deep practical experience in providing high-level policy advice and helping countries in all regions of the world formulate and carry out governance reforms in areas such as anti-corruption, transparency, and natural resources. Please join me in welcoming the panel. So we'll begin with the presentation by Lauren, and we'll hold questions till the end of all the panelists. So Lauren? Okay.
Well, thank you very much. As Joshua kindly said, I'm from the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. And we're here today because IEG has conducted over the last 4 years 2 major studies on fragility and conflict. One was on low-income, or IDA, countries that are on the FCS list, and the other one is on fragility and conflict and violence in non-FCS states. So we've been working on this topic now for 4 years and have a lot of lessons to share. IEG has also done quite a bit of work in its country programs, in the evaluations of the country programs on countries that are experiencing conflict or fragility. In the fragile and conflict state evaluation in low-income states, IEG chose a series of topics to examine in depth that we thought very critical to look at when understanding impact in these areas, and one of them was high-value extractives. Based on that work, the IEG team went to Nairobi to have a series of dialogues with country directors from the World Bank Group that are guiding policy, strategy, and programming in fragile and conflict states. So the work that we're going to talk about today is an extension of that. But first, the first thing that the evaluation examined is why is it important? Why is it important to look at high-value extractives in fragile and conflict states? And the facts are very clear in that when you look at those countries that are consistently on the FCS list, they're 2 times as likely to be dependent on high-value extractives than other states, than those that are sometimes on the list, and particularly those that are never on the list. We also know that most of these countries that are highly dependent on high-value extractives on the FCS list have experienced violent conflict. And lastly, we also know that in terms of their fragility, that some of these states are almost fully dependent, their public revenue streams are almost fully dependent on the revenues from extractives, including Angola, the Central African Republic, the Republic of Congo, and to a lesser extent Yemen, and that's changing right now too in terms of the sources of their revenue streams. So that's why we looked at high-value extractives in low-income countries that are listed on the fragile and conflict state list. And the first thing that we did was to think about how would we examine this? I mean, what kind of frame would we use? And so we used the extractive value chain. And by doing so, what we started to look at is what happens when the World Bank enters into these environments, particularly in post-conflict countries. And in those environments in post-conflict states, we found the following: that in many of these settings, the World Bank has entered and helped to organize the sector, the legal and the institutional environment. And in so doing, what we've provided these fragile environments with is critical access to foreign exchange. Critical access to foreign exchange that helped them during the period of reconstruction and the restoration of their state functions. These interventions also helped these countries through the early reform period that did attract FDI, and to help to restore these functions alongside quite a bit of budget support. But what we also found was that when we look at the implementation of these policies, particularly in the early post-conflict period, that the implementation of the policies are out of step with best practice. And so here are some of the lessons we take away from the review were that in many cases in the post-conflict environment, that contractual agreements were signed too quickly, that we see as part of that early process there was an undercollection of taxes, fees, and royalties, that upfront there was a lack of an ex-ante assessment of societal dynamics, so that the distribution of benefits and local economic development wasn't thought through, wasn't planned throughout the early stages, and of course then therefore a lack of sensitivity to the drivers of conflict and fragility. In these environments, it's critical to also look at sort of the nitty-gritty, the community development agreements and the instruments that you're going to be using when you start to work on your benefit sharing agreements. Then these community development agreements then become very critical. When IEG examined the community development agreements that were associated with some of the work, we found that even though these critical instruments are in place, that many of them lacked specificity. They lacked specificity and the ability to enforce them and to effectively address some of the grievances around the interventions vis-a-vis the agreement itself. In our field work, we worked with Justice for the Poor and found that Justice for the Poor was highly responsive to these local needs. But we also found that Justice for the Poor isn't well enough integrated into the World Bank's operation and into our lending, and that we thought there was a lot more opportunity for Justice for the Poor to become more critically engaged, particularly in local economic development and working on the grievance issues around mining areas. So lastly, I'd say that based on the work that we did in low-income states that are affected by fragility and conflict, that there's some key takeaways from the work that IAG did. And the first one is that sequencing is key, particularly in post-conflict situations, where now, as the FCV group, I think, speaks more widely about the idea that we can use fragility assessments to inform high-value extractive operations. And those fragility assessments, for example, could be sector-led. Two, that there needs to be ex-ante thinking about the capacity of ministries outside the Ministry of Mining to support monitoring enforcement as well as the oversight bodies. Three, we think that if you lodge the revenue management or the dialogue around revenue management and distribution into other public sector reforms where the bank is also present, particularly through our discussions on decentralization, that can contribute to a more stabilized exercise. Fourth, the build analysis upfront, ex ante, of the local social dynamics and historical grievances into design of our operations. And to also think about local benefit sharing arrangements and how those will be affected. And lastly, for the value chain, to continue to think about the way that we can place extractives at the heart or the core of our sustainable development aims. And that has everything to do with thinking about how we're going to support multimodal investments, how we're going to think about local sourcing and skills development and jobs and employment around the HVE operations. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mauricio. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. You laid out some important challenges, and it obviously links to the topic of the paper that we worked on last year. In collaboration, I have to say, with the UN, EU Partnership on Land Conflict and Natural Resources, the UN's framework team, and obviously the bank's oil and gas mining unit where I used to work. And in essence, the paper makes the case for conflict sensitizing the value chain precisely to address some of the issues that Lauren mentioned. And to use the value chain, and we'll see a graph on it soon, to use it as a potential framework for conflict prevention, right? So this means utilizing the value chain and in the 5 links of the chain to identify potential conflict triggers and potential mitigation and prevention actions. So in essence, what the paper is proposing as well is that a conflict-sensitive value chain can help redirect, ultimately, the policy choices that tend to cause and exacerbate conflicts. So let me, I'm not going to be able to get into all the details of the papers, but what I've done, I mean, for those of you who are not familiar with the value chain, this is the one that we use at the bank. We're aware that other organizations or in other parts of the world, they may use a slightly different value chain. But this is the essence of it. You know, starting with award of contracts and licenses, you know, the regulation, monitoring of operations, collection of taxes, revenue management and sharing, and finally, you know, the design of sustainable policies. And so the paper proposes that you know, to look at this value chain as a way of understanding how the different conflict triggers in each link may ultimately be interconnected. So for instance, a flashpoint in one link may trigger another flashpoint in a subsequent link. Lack of consultation during the contractual phase, for instance, may lead to future confrontations with artisanal miners during the operational stage of the mining project, you know? So there is a connection between link 1 and link 2. And for this exercise, we decided to look at 4 different countries, 2 in Latin America and 2 in Africa. Chile and Peru in Latin America, and DRC and Zambia in Africa. Now, let me be clear about this, not for the purpose of comparing them, because these 4 countries, you know, obviously they are mining countries, they are copper producers, but they are not very comparable in a sense. They are very different in terms of their political economy, in terms of their, you know, their culture, their social, economic realities. But it was more for the purpose of illustrating how looking at these different countries, you know, through the value chain and through conflict lenses may lead to some important insights, and also may show us how the value chain behaves differently in these scenarios, you know. Obviously the 2 extreme cases, there's DRC on one side and Chile on the other, right? So now let me get into the next slide. When what I've done is, instead of just providing you with a list of conflict triggers that we have identified under each link, and then potential conflict mitigation measures. I'm just going to highlight 2 or 3 conflict triggers and then share with you the insight that we derived, or the lesson that we derived from looking at some of those countries. So link 1, award of contracts and licenses. Well, obviously, the lack of consultation we already mentioned is very critical here, but more importantly, the lack of inclusion of local concerns within the contract, because there might be consultation, but that consultation may not really lead into including the concerns of the communities in the contract, where, and if it's not in the contract, then it's more difficult to have accountability for the issues that have been raised. There is also issues of local content policies. This refers to local jobs being created, use of local resources. I mean, there's a whole dimension of local content policies, and land disputes, particularly over land purchases, relocation of population, and even compensation schemes. And what we found from looking at in particular with Peru and Zambia in this case, and a little bit of DRC also, is that without adequate and genuine consultation and inclusion, and genuine here is a critical word, an AI project faces a much greater risk of resistance by the community. The communities, they don't want just to be consulted, they want to ensure that their rights and their decisions are actually going to be respected. Another insight is that the likelihood of conflict increases if government is perceived to prioritize resource development at the expense of community interests. And this is a very important balancing act, and very difficult balancing act that any government has to achieve, is because on one hand they want to bring in investment into the country, they want to provide a safe regulatory environment for companies to operate, a predictable environment to operate, but at the same time they want to protect the rights of the communities. But that's not always. That's easier said than done, as we all know. And also the topic of, in the case of Zambia, for instance, during the privatization process in Zambia a couple of decades ago, in the 90s, the early development agreements missed a lot of opportunities to capture fiscal revenues for the country and to create local jobs. So now going to link 2 on the regulation and monitoring operations, some of the highlights on the conflict triggers are obviously, and you might be very well aware of these, environmental risks and disasters, but also the lack of grievances and schemes and compensation mechanisms when these disasters occur, and overall tensions with security forces that may happen due to these disasters. A key takeaway here that particularly we saw in the case of Peru is the issue of a government not being present, particularly in areas that are remote. So without a present, capable and engaged government, the company and community, it's going to be inevitable that there will be tensions between of them, and confrontations that could escalate, very violently. So, and here, what we heard from the conversations we had with policymakers, with private sector, with NGOs, etc., is that what is needed is the government to act as a neutral facilitator, a neutral mediator between the companies and communities. A mediator that is watching for the interests of both companies and communities. On link 3, and again, I'm just giving you a quick overview because there is much more under many of these, under every of these links. But on link 3, we Lauren alluded to this also, the inadequate tax collection, the scheming or lack of fiscal monitoring, overall lack of transparency, right? There's the corruption issue here, but also a mismatch of policies, from central government to local realities and local needs. And in this case, some of the insights that we were able to spot One very interesting from Zambia is that at the end of the day, conflict prevention can be, it's really a political decision that a government can make. And in Zambia, in spite of all these challenges, they have decided to secure peace, and they have found a way to sort of engage with all the different chiefs and you know, chiefs of the different regions in the country and ethnic groups, and make sure that they are on board in terms of preventing violence. Another issue that came up, an insight, was the low capacity of central and local governments to administer the revenues. So one thing is just to get them, you know, from the collection of taxes and royalties, but the other thing is to administer them in an effective way. And there is also this, obviously, the issue of transparency and corruption linked to this culture of personal enrichment, which, you know, we saw in Peru and DRC and other countries as well. So endemic corruption, particularly in DRC, is also a major roadblock for making progress on various fronts. Now, on the revenue management and allocation, some people call it revenue management and sharing as well, some of the conflict triggers that we spotted was this actually lack of tangible benefits or inclusive wealth sharing schemes. And the issue of transparency corruption comes up also in this case as well, and it's also very much linked to the challenge of creating distrust rather than trust. You know, this lack of transparency and corruption creates distrust amongst the communities. And then this issue of lack of government capacity to use the revenue for delivering public services. And some of the insights that started to emerge, and this is more on the positive side, and this is what we saw in the case of Chile, for instance, that there's been in Chile, and it's obvious, this widespread and tangible social benefits. There's a visible and that has a visible impact. And when we look at some surveys about what Chileans think about their extractive industries in general, and Codelco, you know, the copper state company there, a greater percentage, I think it was more than 80%, they trust in what the government is doing with their resources, and they have a trust in Codelco, their state company. So that was a very interesting insight to derive. And we think it's because they can see very specific benefits, and they can see very specific gains of what you know, governments have been doing with these resources. In the same light, I mean, the focus on transparency in Chile, it seemed not to be as critical as in other countries. This is not to say that it's not important, but maybe because Chile has moved to a different level of governance, to a different level of rule of law, and as you know, it's probably one of the most transparent countries in Latin America, you know, least corrupt countries. So the issue of transparency become less of an issue in Chile, right? Because people now tend to focus on some other big other issues. And finally, benefit sharing schemes obviously affect, and we saw this in DRC, the case is clear, can affect the balance of power in a country and generate many levels of resistance, right? And this has to do with the inclusive policies in terms of how to share the benefits from extractive resources in a way that are inclusive, in a way that don't exclude certain groups, certain communities, or certain regions in a country. Then on link on link 5, so this is more a longer term. This was a much more difficult link to sort of pin down because it has to do with longer term vision and longer term, you know, planning of a country. But certainly, you know, in the long run, when you think about the lack of planning for economic sustainability, the lack of economic diversification, and the mismatch between government and public priorities, then it's clear that those are issues that are going to create problems down the road, that may trigger conflict down the road. And again, on the positive side, in terms of positive examples, I highlight Chile again in terms of the efforts they've made in terms of diversifying the economy. And this is not to say that they still have a long way to go, but when you think about wine, when you think about salmon, when you think about other industries, that's Chile, and there's been an effort to, in a way, invest some of the money that they had from extractive industries into these other industries. As a matter of fact, we spoke with people at Fundación Chile, which they're getting the support of BHP Billiton, which is one of the big companies there operating in Chile. And there's been a concerted effort on the part of BHP Billiton to support the development of new industries in the country. So there's really an intended effort to do that. But of course, there are still tensions in a country like Chile. Just to follow on this example, we also saw over the past year, particularly, a lot of debate in terms of using revenues for free education, which is what the public wanted to do, certain segments of society, versus rainy day saving funds, which is what the government was going for. So there's still, and that created quite a bit of tensions, Let me just finish now with some overall conclusions, because I know that running. So just to highlight what's interesting in terms of the overall themes that came through this exercise was that link one, the contract negotiation and licenses, is really crucial, particularly in the short term, in determining immediate risks of conflicts. It is really much gets determined during a contract negotiation. Revenues, project location and scale, site-specific environmental regulations, or any easing of them, potential benefits for communities, local policies, local content agreements, etc. A second point is that this issue of trust, which you probably heard about in different sessions throughout this forum, not only related to extractives, but in general to conflict, but the issue of trust and the lack of it, in this case from communities, lack of trust in government, lack of trust in companies' intentions, it's really a major roadblock for the license, social license to operate. This need of capacity also for investing in projects, for managing revenues, particularly subnational level where there is a lack of more human capital. It's also crucial, and the importance of pursuing an effective engagement at earlier stages, right from the beginning, even before the contract negotiations start, to build that trust. There is a great example with Goldfields, a South African company, which they did some of this work. They engaged early on with communities. It was, I believe it was in Peru also, and they got really impressive results in terms of having a good quality relationship with communities and mutual benefits. And last but not least, in a way, is the issue of the absent government in remote areas. Which that absence of government prevents good quality, effective monitoring of operation, prevents the mediation of conflicts between the companies and between the communities. And finally, we've already mentioned these long-term issues of revenue management and sustainable development policies, but they seem to be quite instrumental in terms, the showing results, the delivery of services. They seem to be instrumental. Links 4 and 5 seem to be very instrumental for that in the longer term. So I'm going to leave it there.
Great, thank you. Before I begin, I want to raise show of hands. I want to know who actually comes from a country with high-value natural resources, where a significant amount of the economy depends on high-value natural resources. Just to get a sense on what kind of questions we're going to get in a bit. Fantastic. I'm Canadian. My name is David Jensen. I'm with the UN Environment Program. And as Maurizio said, we worked collectively on this paper for a number of years. Fantastic process, actually. We were very, very pleased to have this collaboration with the bank. So I want to have two parts to my very short intervention. The first, just adding and complementing a couple of lessons from what Maurizio said. And then the second is I want to introduce you to where we've taken this to the next step in the field. We've got a new partnership between UNEP and the World Bank called MapX, which actually takes this down to the field. So I'll show you a bit of a video on what that looks like. So just to add on, from our perspective, from the UN perspective, number one lesson is that the extractive industry value chain doesn't actually go far enough upstream in trying to prevent conflict. And I think, Lauren, you sort of alluded to this. Josh, if you could just, there's a whole chevron missing vis-a-vis basically conducting and developing a national strategy for extractives, conducting stakeholder and conflict analysis, building national capacity of all the ministries involved, and conducting community consultation. So our immediate observation was, there is a chevron that's missing, and if we're going to use this tool, we have to actually extend it out by one step to effectively prevent conflict. The second key lesson, by and large, this is a photograph from Ogoniland in Nigeria. By and large, within each step, there is no single grievance that leads to violence. It's always a combination of factors. It's never one thing you can point to. So you have to understand the mix of grievances in each step, and you have to understand how conflict in one phase of that value chain transmutates down the phases. So in the case of Nigeria, for example, yes, you have obviously a huge amount of oil production. Next slide. You have fundamental marginalization and a lack of benefit sharing, which is causing grievance. You also have environmental degradation. Next slide. And it's this mix of factors that's led to violence. It's not one factor specifically. So we have to understand the range of factors involved. Now, similarly, if you actually go to any mining site and you talk to the communities around the site, the grievances they actually have, even at the community level around the same site, are different, right? So in the Anyak mine in Afghanistan, this is a photo there, we're doing some community surveys around the mine, and what we're seeing is that the grievances that are already being articulated are different. Some communities are worried about resettlement, some are worried about compensation, some are worried about land and water. They're different. So you really do need a fine-grained approach if you're going to be preventing conflict around these kinds of sites. And this goes to the next lesson. Really, because the conflicts are different, my view is that there's no single international agency that can address all the conflicts across the entire chain. You really need to bring all the capacities together in partnerships like this one. We can, for example, look at some environmental issues. Maybe Habitat can look at land. The bank can look at a range of things, but no single agency has the capacity to do it all. And that calls for partnerships in terms of preventing conflicts across the chain. And the final lesson, asymmetries in government capacity really undermine conflict prevention across the chain. And this I'm really speaking from the environment program. If you actually look at a lot of grievances, they're very much environmental. But when, for example, the bank went into Sierra Leone, there wasn't a lot of capacity directed towards the EPA. And I just want to play a little game with you now. Just go to the next slide. So this is Sierra Leone in 2010. This is a shot of the concessions covering Sierra Leone. It's about 80% of the land base covered by either exploration or development concessions. So almost the entire surface area of Sierra Leone. Now the game I want to play is called Guess the Capacity of the EPA to regulate this. So just in your minds, think about this. What do you think in 2010 was the staff of the Environmental Protection Agency and the budget to regulate this sector? So just get a sense, just get your own guesses in mind, and if anybody gets it right, you win a report. Next slide. Okay, so this in 2010 is the full staffing complement of the EPA, 9 individuals, bullet point, with a budget of $120,000. All right, so anybody get that correct? Even remotely to a magnitude get that correct? Oh, okay, there's reports out back, you all can take a report. So what does this mean? There were 270 environmental impact assessments sitting on the desk of the EPA with one person to review all 270. It's a huge backlog, impossible to really regulate. And if you talk about monitoring and inspecting mining sites, there were 2 people that could do it. Of course, they had no vehicle and no ability to get around. So you've got a huge investment in Ministry of Mines, Ministry of Energy, to start extracting the resources, but almost no investment in some of the other capacities that are needed on the regulation side, especially to prevent environmental damage and conflict from that damage. And that's the key point. It's the conflict that could be triggered by the damage that's important. Next slide. So In conclusion, we did this study, and as Maurizio said, we looked across the chain. We said, what are the two core deficits across the entire chain? And we realized, yeah, there are two, basically. There's a fundamental trust deficit across the entire chain. Nobody trusts anybody. Stakeholders basically are divided. Communities don't trust anybody. Governments and companies have a lack of trust. And basically, there's a whole trust deficit. And the other deficit is an information deficit. Sorry. And the other one is an information deficit. There is no source of authoritative information that communities can get on the sector. And the governments also feel an information deficit. And these interact. So you have a trust and information deficit. So that's the end of part one of the narrative. That took us to the end of this process. And right when we were coming to the end of the process, the chair of the G7 Plus came forward and said, look, World Bank, UN, we're struggling with information issues in the extractive sector. We would like assistance in improving transparency across the value chain on revenues, but also on benefits and benefit sharing, and on risks and impacts. So can you help us bring us new technology in IT and cloud computing and big data to design systems that could help us bring transparency across the whole system? And we said, aha, this is fantastic. Now we can take the lessons from this process, and we can use this request, and we can come together with a system to try to do exactly that. So Josh, this is what led to MapX, and Josh will play the video now of what MapX is and what it's going to do for transparency and trust building across the value chain. it's a sampling of where we're trying to take this cooperation, and that's all I have to say. So afterwards, we can talk a little bit more about MapX, but thank you very much.
So we've heard from 3 panelists so far, and the takeaways that I've gotten from this are that we need better tools, we need tools and strategies to better understand the drivers of conflict and integrate information about those drivers into our contracting processes, into our sectoral capacity building processes, and our oversight and implementation processes. And we've seen 3 tools. Mauricio presented a framework for understanding how different aspects of the extractive industry value chain can help us map out the drivers of conflict and insert information into various aspects of operations, contracting, reinvestment. Lauren described the potential of using fragility assessments to help understand the drivers of conflict and point at sectoral level interventions that could help reduce conflict or prevent conflict. And David presented the MapX tool, which can help us increase transparency and thereby build trust among stakeholders in the extractive sector. So now I'd like to invite 2 discussants to provide first an internal perspective and then an external perspective on the opportunities for using tools like this to prevent conflict in the extractive sector, the challenges to doing it, to using these sorts of tools, but also how we might overcome those challenges to better infuse information in the extractive industry sector. So I'll turn it now to Chris.
Well, firstly, thank you to the organizer for inviting me. So I'm a manager for extractive industries, and I'm here at a Fragility Forum talking about conflict. And so some may wonder, well, why would you be interested in that topic? And I've got to say, I mean, worked in the mining industry for a number of years before I joined the World Bank. And when I looked at our portfolio, I'm managing most of our lending operations around the world, I realized that almost half of the work we were doing was in fragile countries. And I'd always sort of resisted this a little bit because, I didn't want to have, this sort of feeling that it caused conflicts, and I still wasn't convinced if that was the case, but now I am convinced that sometimes it's the case and sometimes it's not the case. But there was no disputing the fact that there was often this interrelationship between the conflict and the resources themselves. And then if I was going to do a great lending operation in a country with help them to develop their resources, but I ignored this sort of issue of conflict and fragility, then I wouldn't be able to achieve the goals that we had at the World Bank to reduce poverty in that country. Because if I had a great successful mining or oil and gas operation, yet a conflict broke out, then all the gains that we could gain through that would all be gone because of the conflict. So just as much as we want to try to promote responsible investment, if we don't address environmental risk and the risk of fragility and conflict, at the same time, we're not really helping our client countries. So I started to rethink the approach that we had. I also felt that for sort of this internal perspective, we're a bit disconnected even inside the World Bank, that we had a group that worked on fragility, none of whom I knew, and I had my mining team sitting up in the IFC working on mining, not interconnected in any way whatsoever. And I think both we and also the fragility group started to realize the importance of really collaborating and working together. So we started to do that. And I was thrilled the fragility group invited me to a big learning event that they had, what Lauren was referring to when she spoke to the country directors. I also went there. I think I was the only sector that was there, and I was like, wow, this is so nice to be invited. And I was so shocked to see that every single one of those country directors, when they talked about their countries, in some way, natural resources, minerals, or oil and gas, were connected in with what they were dealing with in their countries. And then I started to hear from East Timor, the former president there, talked about how tools that we advocate, like EITI and sovereign wealth funds, were instrumental in bringing peace and stability in that country. So I started to gain some hope that, wow, if I'm working on these countries, if I can use these tools, then I can really help reduce the risk of conflict. And then anything I do that helps bring good, responsible investment in the country is going to lead towards the goals of the bank and not the other way around. So we started changing the way that we were working and started doing joint work internally with fragility and conflict and with other parts of the bank, and even retrofitting some of our projects. I mean, and so the framework that we use in extractors when we look at a country is this sort of value chain, and we break down a lot of our interventions along the value chain. So it's actually very useful to have this as a organising framework for us to look at when we're going to do something on laws and regulations, are we considering the conflict that happened in this particular country and how the laws and regulations maybe need to be tweaked or adjusted in order to make sure that that conflict doesn't happen again? Or if about revenue distribution, are we putting in place the right things that would, if there was a grievance at the local level about how revenue is distributed, are we putting in place the right things that would help avoid that risk? Because we always put in all of our work, good mining regulation, transparent decision-making. But in some places, there was a lack of understanding about how licenses were awarded, why this company got it, and that would lead to conflict. So we needed to build that into the way that the whole legal framework worked. Similarly with the way benefits were distributed, for us, it was kind of enough that the local population was going to get X% of the royalty income. We thought, great, local people are going to benefit. But if the village chief just keeps all the money and the local people don't get anything, then we have a conflict. So we needed to make sure that there was something more that was done, that there was transparency about actually how the revenue was distributed to the local people. So we started sort of retrofitting some of our projects and doing joint work and looking at these issues with both sets of expertise, the expertise on fragility and conflict and also the expertise on extractives. Because likewise, I felt, if you don't understand the nature of extractives, it's hard sometimes to really address the conflict issues. If I start to look outside a little bit from inside the World Bank, many of our staff, including myself, came from the private sector, who has to deal with these conflicts on a daily basis. I used to work at a gold mine in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. There was always conflict between the mine and the communities in some form, usually over disputes of damage to land or trees and things like that. Also disputes amongst people in migration from outside communities and local populations, upset with them. It was constant issues of conflict, and companies, they have to deal with those things. Some of us were talking a little bit earlier. I mean, in a low commodity price environment, I think that changes things, but it doesn't make things go away. And JJ Mesner was just talking to me about how the companies, they can't walk away from these mines. They can't just sell them. There's not many buyers out there. They have to deal with these problems. Now, then Krista was saying they wanted to deal with it for less money than they might have when the boom was on, so cost-effective solutions. But likewise, we need to partner with, from development institutions, we need to partner with the private sector in finding solutions. There's a lot of conflict between large and small-scale miners. So the World Bank worked with two of the biggest gold mining companies in the world and the government of Tanzania to put in place something that would be sort of multi-stakeholder partnership to reduce the conflict between large and small-scale miners. So I think there's internal coordination that's needed on these things, but also there's coordination needed with the private sector to find good solutions that reduce the risk of conflict. So that's my pitch, I guess, forward-looking is just because commodity prices are low, problems don't go away. In fact, even more attention, I think, in many respects is needed. At times where prices are low, there's even a propensity, I think, to grab what you can while you still can. And I think in many respects, conflict risk actually goes up. Also, when good investors are not investing, you get a lot of unscrupulous people coming in, wanting to do special deals with government in a non-transparent way. That also increases risks. So for all these reasons, I actually think the bank at a time like this should be focusing much more on this link between natural resources and the risk of conflict to help avoid that taking place as much as we can, and then work with the private sector as a partner, along with the governments, in trying to reduce that risk.
Now I'd like to invite Danny Kaufman to present an external view.
We should discuss at some point this notion of external versus internal. Aren't we all in this challenge together also? I spent nearly 25 years here, so it's great to be back. Can I ask for a Mauricio's value chain? Because I'll refer a little bit to that, which I thought was a useful way of framing it, and it's an integral part of that paper, which we're asked to comment on. But let me organize my thoughts, and I heard all the commentators and the presentations, which are very good, and on an absolutely critical topic. So I'll organize it around about five 5 issues and main comments, and with an attempt, heads up, to be also provocative for the sake of discussion. The first question, and there I come as an outsider to the field a bit, although I've always been interested, but I come from the governance perspective, which I've studied for a long time. I'm not a world expert on social conflict. So we asked from very early on in governance the question, what are we talking about when we talk about governance? And I would still want to ask that question about social conflict. What do we mean when we talk about social conflict? Governance just in itself, it's such a mushy term and so on. And I think there's a similar challenge regarding social conflict. And we need, and I'm sure there's a lot of literature, but it would be useful for the sake of the discussion today to have at least a basic typology. And I know that there are many ways of skinning a cat, but for starters, at a very simple level, it seems that there may be two very different types of conflict. One, which we could call conflict of resistance, and another conflicts of coexistence. Conflict of resistance, it's much more fundamental. It's about the very existence of a major project. Offers very small room for negotiation. In the case of conflict of coexistence, which seems to be implicit in much of the discussion here, the reality is different, and it all centers around the conditions of the project. And let's note that conflict of coexistence, if not addressed correctly, can lead to conflicts of resistance to having a project in the first place, and we are witnessing that in many settings. Now, I'm sure there are other ways of skinning it, but I think it would be useful, like what we did in governance, and we unbundled it, in our case, into 6 different components, which we understood what the rule of law is, and what is corruption, and what is this and that, but they must be, and you are experts on that, some discussion around it, which I didn't see very clearly in at least the papers I managed to read. So that's the first point, and that leads to the second and related one. What is the value of a value chain framework to diagnose and make recommendations? Which is you take a value chain framework. I think there is a high value. And of course, I should think that because we have also developed for a number of years a natural resource charter, which has many commonalities with this, and also follows not only the value chain, but the decision-making chain, and it's not that dissimilar. So I think it's a useful framework. So the challenge I don't see, or the problem I don't see much in terms of what we call errors of commission, or what's in it, but what is missing. And let me just focus, for the sake of time, on 2 aspects, 2 components that may need to be more fully integrated. 2-pronged. First, let's not be surprised, that's my hat, it's governance. Okay? Now, one thing we do in the charter is in the Natural Resource Charter is recognize up front, and I know we're at the World Bank, but we need to recognize up front that this cannot be addressed as a purely technocratic issue of just going through value chains, and these are the issues. Overlaying the whole framework as umbrella has to be domestic governance, and particularly the whole question of how to hold those that make those decisions to account. So the issue of accountability and how one gets to accountability and reform is crucial. And 2 aspects are absolutely critical there in terms of domestic governance. There are others, but let me just put 2 on the table. One is civic space. Is it there or not? Are we talking about Azerbaijan, Venezuela, or Peru? Totally different realities that would have major implications for this very technocratic approach. That's domestic governance. Underneath, we have also the international governance framework, and we have heard precious little about the role and responsibilities of the rich countries, industrialized countries and the multinationals in this, which are absolutely key actors. And that's where, obviously, and I, for full disclosure, I'm in the international board, so I'm biased, but initiatives like EITI are very important, particularly now when in the new standard that has evolved from the old rules, which just focus on disclosure of payments at the national central level. Now there are many other components, and one crucial component is subnational disclosures, and transparency is absolutely key. So where is all the discussion and framework of disclosure about that subnational? But then it's also the mandatory reporting requirements, and what's still ongoing a few blocks away here at the SEC with the American Petroleum Institute, big oil, particularly US. This is the other chevron. You mentioned one chevron missing. There is another chevron missing in this, and the Exxons and those that do not fully yet have not jumped aboard this transparency wagon. So there is those two aspects, governance ones, which is international, domestic, and then what I mentioned earlier. Oh no, the second I have not mentioned is what should be, in my view, number one, before the one which is here, and that is basically the decision to extract. Where is the basic decision to extract before the award of contracts and licenses, particularly in the new reality of today, with not only the very low commodity prices, but the post-COP, Paris, climate change, and where we are facing a reality where we need to ask the question, what's the post-extractive, basically, outlook and strategy for what are now resource-rich countries in terms of a diversification, in terms of what to get out of the ground, what doesn't make sense, what are going to be the mechanism of compensation, particularly in those areas which are high carbon intensive. So that's oil and coal in particular, less so in mining and so on. But I think, and if we are discussing the issue of social conflict, as I said earlier, in terms of the definitional aspects, it's absolutely crucial to question and to put it up front, the issue of many communities not wanting to extract, being anti-extractivist for a variety of legacy and other reasons. For that, a major assessment is needed of technical, economic, financial viability, taking the environmental issues into account, and there will be many communities where such an assessment and analysis where the World Bank can play a major role makes sense to still extract, but it's no presumption that will make sense in the future to extract everywhere, which is kind of implicit in this framework. Then, more generally, let me just make some points about the importance and more emphasis that should be put, and it is already there. It's part of the discussion on zoning and consultation, including the controversial issues of prior and informed consent, but those issues probably should come first. The whole issue of dialogue and communication and managing expectation and negotiation, it's absolutely crucial if one is going to prevent conflict, obviously. Then there is the issue of what is the state presence and capacity at the local level. We have not discussed much here the role of companies, but in many instances, particularly in fragile states, what happens is that there's a complete vacuum. And you mentioned the EPA example very well. There's a complete state vacuum at the local level. So the expectation from the community is that the companies are going to fully substitute and replace the role of government, which is totally unrealistic, and also it emasculates institution building from the state. So there has to be an approach by which companies and central government and with the fledgling local governments work together towards developing that state capacity there, rather than expecting that the company will take over that type of role. There are other, the importance of developing conflict monitoring systems, it's key, and there are good examples right now in in Peru, as well as subnational public and private capacities being developed, like in Moquegua regional government, also in Peru. For the sake of time, I will mention, but we can elaborate on that later. It's very interesting also in Peru, the Oficina de Diálogo and Sostenibilidad, that is an effort for these conflict management systems and protocols. The point being here that there are innovations and there are initiatives, and countries like Peru and Colombia are showing that yes, it is possible, and they're dealing with many of these issues. Let me make quickly a third, fourth, and then last point. One, which is particularly germane, which we need to integrate fully the world reality today, what's happening because of the crash in commodity prices and related world conditions. The real risk, which is happening already in some countries, of a race to the bottom in terms of essentially governments, some out of fiscal desperation, negotiating deals which are very adverse to communities, and essentially not only lowering the prices that they get and how much revenues they would get for obvious market reasons, but lowering the environmental and social standards, and particularly those issues that affect communities. So there's a real risk now of, in fact, enhancing the probability of conflict, because in the rush to compete to have the few deals remaining that companies may be interested, these may happen. And there's data to show that there's increasing number of conflicts from around the world. Fourth is, yes, conflict prevention is absolutely key, and I like that priority. But let's face it, given what we're discussing, given the reality today, many conflicts will not be prevented, in spite of any heroic effort by the bank and others. So we need to pay much more attention to learning from the conflicts that have taken place, that are taking place, and unfortunately will take place. In fact, let me make the provocative suggestion that conflicts can be an engine of change, even destructive ones. And there are, again, very interesting examples from Peru, where unfortunately in 2009 was a major indigenous a confrontation between governments and indigenous people and the police in the northern Amazon city of Bagua. 32 people were killed. But that made it evident to everybody about the need for consultations, and led to the approval in 2011 of a consultation law. Similar things have happened. In fact, now, in terms of 5 deaths so far around the Conga project in the Yanacocha company and so on, that is leading to all kinds of responses and innovation from the government. Let me just end by suggesting that we are working on a number of such subnational initiatives, including in Peru with a group of Propuesta Ciudadana, in Piura, Moquegua, and also in Colombia with a royalty system and the revenue sharing mechanism, and in Mexico we have started as well. And we are also totally devoted and sold to the power of data and open data in particular. So we have deployed all kinds of tools complementary to what you were suggesting. You can go to the web resourcecontracts.org. There are more 70 contracts totally online about the DRC, and we have many other such examples that we can suggest, including creating a database that will be soon online on resourceprojects.org, which is project-level data from the mandatory disclosure in the EU, now the US, we hope, and so on. Let me just end by saying that, of course, in fragile states, there's a huge challenge about both the availability and the quality of data. So we need to pay as much attention, not just to openness data and put it up there, but work with them in terms of capacity building and generating data where the quality is enhanced. Thank you.
Thank you. From both Chris and Danny, very insightful and very thoughtful and very provocative statements. Please join me in thanking the panel. can we have a few minutes for just a few questions? If we could, please come to the, well, we're a small room. We'll start here and then there, and then we'll answer. And please direct to the panelists.
Thank you very much. Is that working?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Annette Hoffman. I work as a researcher for a Dutch research institute called Klingendaal, and I particularly look into the relationship between private sector development and peace building. We've done and we're doing work with the IFC together on a private sector focused conflict fragility analysis, and we've looked into Zimbabwe, including several sectors, also mining. Thank you very much for all the inputs. I'm trying to keep it short, but I've read the report. I think it's very interesting. What I'm missing is this whole concept that is being discussed in other sessions as well of a political settlement. We know the institutions are weak, enforcement mechanisms are not there. We've heard about a lot of conflicts at the community level, but the concept of political settlement is so interesting because it shows us where power is really being managed and sustained, and where communities are actually linked to political elites through the payment of, or the exchange of favors, basically. Which brings me to my question. So first question would be, can that still be addressed? I think that is still missing in the report and is crucial and cuts across all the different levels of the value chain. Now, if we know that it is all about these pacts between elites and that they have a very strong interest to keep the things as they are, vested interest in the status quo, how likely is it that data will be fed into these new innovative, beautiful tools? And has the bank, and that was my question to you, of course, and has the bank actually thought about the violence or instability that you're most likely to prompt if you start dismantling those systems and revenue flows that are opaque, no, not transparent at all, but that maintain a political elite pact in place, like Zimbabwe, that gives some short to medium term stability. Thank you.
Professor Georgetown. Just a quick question, it may not be the right thing. Is anybody doing the same for renewables? So talking about kind of as we build wind farms and solar huge complexes, is anybody thinking about how do we engage with communities? It's a different type of engagement, but I haven't seen any writing on that.
Mark Bulmer. I'm the Chief Geologist at the Ministry of Defence in the UK. I'm really intrigued by the conflict characterization that I've heard today. I'm really interested. We are now in a situation where we've just seen a coalition of governments go ahead and move from just trying to degrade oil to actually trying to destroy oil. So something really significant has happened here that you haven't addressed at all, which is outside actors, in this instance, coming together and actively targeting one of the extractive industries here. How does that fit with what you've got here? Thank you.
All right, shall we start with responses? Please.
They're great questions, actually. Wow. I mean, firstly, to address your question, I guess. I think these things are just really difficult, and it's very, very hard to change things when they're very well entrenched. So very often in appropriate countries, we do a political economy analysis before we go in and do our reforms, because you realize unless we understand where the power is, we can naively go in and put something in place that actually gives more power to the wrong people. So first I'd say that I don't think there's any silver bullet, and that I wouldn't say that any of this is very easy to do at all. And we've seen that in places even where we've gone in and I think there has to be a sort of openness and an appetite for reform in a country. So we've gone in, Sierra Leone would be an example where we went in and we were able to separate the, working with governments, not as well by coming and saying do this, but working with them to separate the policy setting function of the Ministry of Mines from the regulatory function by setting up a separate mineral resources authority. So that sort of separates the powers. But I could see as we went through over time and things settled down a bit, there's an attempt to kind of get that power back. So you do have to really stay the course of reform, which goes back to my earlier point is when commodity prices are down, there's a feeling like, oh, well, as development partners, let's not focus so much in this sector because there's not as much money in it. But that's exactly the right time to press in and get good reforms. When commodity prices are low, revenues for governments are down, the pressure is on from their people. If you can have greater transparency of licensing, of data, I think it allows people to hold their governments more accountable, and that's the time you need to press in more to get change. So I actually think this is a great time to get change. When prices are really high, it's very hard to get a government to listen to you. People are generally happy, money's being spread around. It's harder to get change then, but I'm not saying that it's easy. But one thing I was thinking about a couple of weeks ago, DRC it's probably 7 years ago now, the World Bank started a project around governance in mining, and the government did some non-transparent actions regarding the sale of assets, and the bank froze its program and the IMF for about a year and a half. As a result of that, they put in place a thing called the governance matrix, which required all sales by the state mining company and by government of all mining deals had to be made transparent. And when that was all made transparent, there was some analysis done by civil society organisations that showed many billions of dollars of lost revenue by governments selling it too cheaply. And I've been out to DRC a few times and worked on this. I can't recall a single sale of that nature since those measures were put in place. But that's not saying that there's no corruption. I'm sure, that's not saying that nothing's happening that shouldn't happen. But by putting in place more transparency and by empowering people to hold their governments more accountable, I think the risk of that goes down. On renewables, yeah, I'm part of energy and extractive industries. I work on the oil, gas and mining side, but I know my colleagues who work on renewables, they also really try to look at the social impacts of all of this as well. I'm just not as familiar with it. And on the attacks on oil, yeah, it's a pretty interesting question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for that. I mean, we do work a lot on the upstream work that includes the oil sector. We do a lot more on the promotion of gas as a transition fuel that we think is cleaner than coal and matches very well to renewables, actually. Less on sort of the promotion of oil. With the drop in oil prices, we've focused a lot actually on reducing subsidies, which is another area where I think governments spend a lot of money and maybe not always to the benefit of the poor. So, but that's not really answering your question. I think it's a much bigger question, probably take a lot more time to answer.
I just quickly point also to some of EG's other work to promote, I think, a bit of our work on forestry, for example, where we recognize that work with land-based assets, forest cover and oil palm and other issues like that are so much more impactful because of the reasons that you mentioned, for example, just the number of square hectares that you're covering and the impacts that have on human life and livelihood. Not to say that it's not impactful around mines, but because the impacts are localized more as opposed to sort of some of the impacts we're seeing with oil palm and forests. So, but we have a forest evaluation. I'd love to share it with you. Yeah.
We're almost out of time. We're over time, but we'll give the last word to Danny and then open this up to a conversation afterward.
Oh, I didn't mean to have the last word. I just wanted to add something, so please, you have the last word. But just linking this set of comments with a very important question about political settlement that was asked before, I'd like to just put again on the table the importance of these innovations in the past few years regarding multi-stakeholder initiatives and bringing not only civil society, communities, and government together, but also the companies, the private sector, which sometimes hold much more power and influence than some of the local governments. That's one of the things that EITI, not only at the global level, but much more important at the national level, is doing. And the idea is to try to now go to the subnational level. Each country that has committed and entered EITI, 51 by now, has to have a national multi-stakeholder group that engages in this type of discussion and negotiation. And to replicate that more and more at the community level it's very important. EITI also, within EITI, there is now space and room for countries to innovate and put also the renewables in. So some countries are putting forestry, they're putting the environmental issues like Colombia and so on. And the mandatory disclosure now, where Dodd-Frank was the early leader, was surpassed because of the politics of big oil here by the European Union, which now adopted already mandatory requirement, is being implemented in the UK. Under the EU directives, forestry is part of it, which is also great news. Last but not least, let's keep in mind that even though some of the community issues may be common, and that's why it's important to embrace the renewables, there are also incredibly important distinctions. The whole economics and politics of renewables are very different than non-renewables. So in terms of the advice, in terms of following this chain and so on, there are also important distinctions, and particularly in the new world reality, post-COP, getting away from carbon and so on. So I think we should also keep in mind that it requires different approaches and expertise. But there is a very important link, particularly in the mining sector, with what you're talking about, and that's water. The issues at the community level of water around mining are incredibly important, and there we all need to link up better with the water sector, because that's so crucial for communities and for social conflict eventually, prevention.
I'll take the moderator's prerogative and end the discussion with one question. So we've heard quite a bit today about infusing more and better data into the entire extractive industry process and the entire extractive industry sector via the value chain and other tools. The question I want to pose for everyone to think about is, how do we make that process of collecting, analyzing, understanding, and inserting information in the process and then institutionalizing the results of that analysis, how do we make that process dynamic? How do we make it a living process? It's easy if I'm an environmental specialist doing my environmental analysis to check boxes, if I'm a social specialist to check safeguards, if I'm a government government regulator to do my review, my sector review, my operational permit review, check a box. But we know that conflicts are living. We know that social dynamics are living. We know that the lifespan of something like a mine can be hundreds of years, particularly when you think about the legacy issues. So how do we keep ourselves cognizant and aware of the dynamics as they continue to change, and reassess social dynamics, reassess drivers of conflict throughout the entire life cycle of a project? I think that's the challenge for us as we work on either the operational, the project level, or the sector level. And so that is the question I'll pose to you for discussion afterward, and I'd like to thank the panelists once more.